Thank you. I am honored to be present at this conference, which I believe to be a remarkable initiative, and I'm happy to share with you my concern, which is also yours, as Fotis, Kafatos, and Rainer Sauerborn have mentioned earlier, for encounter between disciplines. But I ask you to consider me as one of the last representatives of a lost world, which existed a long time ago, a world in which there was no PowerPoint, not even overhead, only paper and pen. And the tribe I belong to is probably known by you under the designation French social anthropologist.
Which means he's written about 10 books.
But from Paul's experience a while ago, there might be still some justification which we have long forgotten to this retrograde attitude towards computers. I first met Puleng in April 2002. She was living in the basement of a shack in Alexandra, the oldest township of Johannesburg. The room where she spent most of her time, nights and days, was less than 8 square meters. It had a bed, which occupied most of the space, and where she slept with her young daughter. It opened towards a 2 square meters kitchen, where she boiled tea for me. The room was dark and noisy because of the wooden ceiling which separated it from the owners of the shack, who were listening to music. Puleng was 29 and had AIDS. She probably weighed less than 40 kilos and had a face swollen like children with kwashiorkor. She had told the voluntary workers of the local social service that she was willing to meet the anthropologist whom she had heard of. When we sat in front of her, as she lay dying, she started immediately, almost like if it were an emergency, with a feeble, hardly inaudible voice. My name is Puleng. I was born in Baragounath Hospital in 1973. I grew up in Soweto until the age of 7. Then I came to Alex in this same house where we are now. And this is where I always lived. When I was a child, my father left away, and my mother raised us alone. She tried so hard, but she drank so much. When she had taken alcohol, we used to sleep in the street. I have a sister. She was born in 1976. I had a brother also. He was born in 1978. He was my best friend. He died when he was 20. He was shot by the police. Then came this disease. They told me about it in 1998. I never drank. I never smoked. I never had time to go to hotels or to casinos. I only had 4 boyfriends in my whole life. The first one, when I was in high school, he left me. The second one, I separated from him. The third one, he was married. I couldn't stay with him. And then the father of my child. I lived 10 years with him. He was good to me, but he cheated me. I discovered he had another girlfriend, and his girlfriend died. I said to him, "How could you do that to me? You're killing me now with this disease." We are living here, happy with my child. She's 12 now. She goes to school. I want her to be somebody. So you see, this is my life, a life of misery. We've been suffering so much. But I was talented. I used to write stories when I was a child. The first one, it was after reading a book on Florence Nightingale. And I liked to write poems. I liked to study. I wanted to be a doctor because it's nice to heal people. I was so talented. Now my life is sinking, but I'm very strong, very, very strong. And I'll still live until God decides me to pass away. She had told us the story of her life in one breath. We had not asked one single question. We had not interrupted her. We had only listened to her while she talked. Later, we would come back to get precisions or explanations. But at that moment, the silence fell on her last words. I long wondered why Poulenc had such a need to tell us her biography, what she wanted to say so urgently to French anthropologists working on AIDS, just like the Haitian patients asked Paul to show their pictures, and I must say that Poulenc is a real name. I didn't change it, as it is usual to change. We kept coming to see her, bringing her food, but above all, a notebook that she had asked us to bring her, and a pen so that she could write. She died on the 27th of July of that same year, this year. She had never received antiretroviral drugs. She had obtained a disability grant, but the first payment arrived a few days after her death. It served to finance the coffin and the burial. She had left a notebook for us with 2 pages handwritten, a short biography again, ending with these words, "This is all I can share with you about my life." What did she mean by leaving her biography, or better said, her life, to us? And what could we do of such a precious gift, in exchange of which there cannot be any equivalent counter-gift, to use an anthropological concept? I would like this conference to be a modest and uncertain interpretation, not only of her life story, but also of the signification she gave to the fact of delivering us this message. AIDS, as we all know, is a matter of life and death. But in South African townships, whether individually for the sick or collectively for the communities, AIDS has become a matter of living with death. As rates of infection are so high, more than 1/4 of the adult population, and as treatments are not available except pneumocystis prophylaxis and DOTS protocol for tuberculosis. The day we went to meet her, to meet her mother after Poulenc's death, we saw 3 funerals in her neighborhood. The obituary pages of the Sowetan are full of pictures of young men and women of whom AIDS has taken heavy toll. But death and disease are not equally distributed in South African population. Like all over the world, but here with the unique intensity inherited from centuries of colonization, oppression, segregation, and finally apartheid, morbidity and mortality are characterized by deep socioeconomic, racial, and gender inequalities. Being poor, black, and a woman, Poulenc understood she was on the wrong side all along. With her absent father, her mother often drunk, her beloved brother killed by the police, her own life spent in the basement of a shack, she knew by experience what inequality is about. But her sense of injustice reached its climax when she realized that society made her responsible for what happened to her. In South Africa, just like all over the world, AIDS is the result of risky behaviors, which are not only epidemiologically dangerous, but also morally reproved. Hence, her insistence to mention that she had never drunk, nor smoked, nor gone to houses of pleasure. She had 4 boyfriends in her whole life, she asserts. What she resists to is this double injustice. First, to be dying of AIDS at the age of 29. Secondly, to be blamed for it. So for us, today, to recognize inequality as such is not only to acknowledge a crucial determinant of the epidemic, it is also to alleviate the psychic burden of its victims. Thinking in terms of embodied inequality is a scientific as well as a political issue. We are getting here to a central question for social epidemiology as well as medical anthropology, for biologists and physicians as well as social scientists. How do social inequalities translate into physical disparities? How is the social order inscribed in individual bodies? In crude words, why must Poulenc die? Of course, one should not be too deterministic in answering this question. We know for a century that poverty is not a necessary cause of tuberculosis. It is what epidemiologists might call a risk factor, what anthropologists would name a structural condition. What we must shed light on is the link between social reality and biological facts. As far as AIDS is concerned, for example, between poverty and the virus. But the relation is bidirectional, from the social to the biological, and from the biological to the social. How does the epidemic becomes a social fact is also a question, historically recognized and culturally interpreted. This is not only an intellectual issue for philosophers, it's also a practical question that we have to deal with when we talk about denial, for instance, whether it comes from a lay person or from the head of state. In order to clarify conceptually this relation between social and biological realities, and to give it a very concrete application for AIDS in South Africa, but we could think of other infections and of other countries, I propose the concept of embodiment of inequality. Embodiment means inscription in the body, both physical and psychic. I consider that it has two dimensions. The first one is objective. It refers to the way in which social structures and norms are translated into everyday life, in particular in risk-taking, individual security, rights over one's own body, access to information, prevention, and treatment. We can call it the social condition of the person. The second one is subjective. It refers to the way in which sense is given to their existence by people who live with it, in terms of interpretation of misfortune or disease, of what is happening to them individually and collectively. We can call it the social experience of the person. So, objective social condition and subjective social experience, both dimensions are narrowly linked. This is what embodied inequality is about. From this perspective, the global controversy raised by the South African president, Thabo Mbeki, around AIDS can be understood as the transposition of Poulenc's story in the national and international space. In his opening speech at the Durban AIDS conference, Thabo Mbeki talks about what I call here embodied inequality. He uses other words, poverty, he says, but I think inequality is a much more relevant word. And he expresses other feelings, resentment towards the white and the Western world, I should say, but his discourses and his sentiments have to do with what I designated a while ago as a social condition and a social experience of inequality. The problem is that he lacks a theory, or more simply an intuition, on how to link rather than make exclusive of each other a biological cause, the virus, and a social fact, domination. In a country where HIV seroprevalence rates have risen from less than 1% in 1990 to more than 25% in 2000. The contribution of human sciences to understand this link has been predominantly behavioral and culturalist through KABP studies in particular. But it is neither through behavioral models, because risk-taking is embedded in social structures and spaces, nor through culturalist explanations such as the alleged belief in the rape of virgins as a means to get purification and healing we have heard of. That one can bring an answer to this difficult question, it is through sociological and anthropological work grounded in empirical data and formulated in analytical propositions. Social science, or sciences, in collaboration with biomedical sciences, have to urgently address this challenge. Otherwise, the tragic errors made by the South African government in a country where almost 5 million people are infected by HIV will continue and could even spread. What I mean is that it is our responsibility and to bring this kind of theory. Would Thabo Mbeki have critical socio-biomedical theories available from us, explaining how the virus was not incompatible with poverty, things might have been different. So first, the social conditions of AIDS, what some of us call structural violence, can be analyzed through three main dimensions: socioeconomic situation, spatial mobility, and sexual violence. This is not limited to these three, but these are the three that I will study. They are closely linked and deeply inscribed in the history of South African society. Let us examine them separately. The socioeconomic situation is a potent predictor of HIV infection, and surveys in industrial plants show that seroprevalence rates are 5 times higher for unskilled workers than for the management. But when racial characteristics are taken into account, among all categories, seroprevalence rates are 5 times higher for black than white employees. Thus, a black manager is more often infected than a white unskilled worker. This adds to the fact that blacks are a lot more represented at the bottom of the socioeconomic pyramid, where seroprevalence is the highest. When one tries to analyze how socioeconomic, which are also racial, hierarchies, overdetermine HIV seroprevalence, it appears that the material conditions of everyday life for people in the townships, as well as in rural areas, make risk of having unprotected and often unwanted sex extremely high, with problems of alcohol, street insecurity, working mother leaving children at home, and so on. But it also appears that the symbolic value of risk and even life itself is relativized, as, for example, for a mine worker, the risk of mine accidents or diseases is much more immediate and obvious than sexually transmitted disease. And at some point, risk-taking, whether at work or in sex, even becomes associated with masculinity and virility. Spatial mobility is a second well-identified factor of high seroprevalence. Urban-rural migration is the most obvious form of this mobility, and working men living with girlfriends in town and returning to their families in the countryside have been considered as important vectors of the epidemic. Nevertheless, recent epidemiologic studies in rural KwaZulu-Natal show that in serodiscordant couples, it is the woman who is infected in 40% of the cases. These data shed a new light on migration of both sexes of poor people living in precarious conditions in hostels or shacks of the townships. But mobility during the 90s has also been related to massive displacements of war refugees from Angola, Rwanda, Burundi, and Zaire, to the return of the veterans of the South African National Defense Corps from Namibia, Mozambique, and other places of conflict where the apartheid regime was engaged, to the coming back of political opponents and liberation armies from their exile abroad after the reauthorization of opposition parties in 1990, Finally, to the economic immigration of Africans from all over the continent, searching for the new El Dorado after the end of the international embargo on South Africa. All these movements were provoked or accelerated by the democratic changes in South Africa. And finally, sexual violence is a third determinant. Beyond the dramatic cases of children raped by neighbors or parents, in a local program called the Greater Nilsprout Rape Intervention Project in the north of the country, the northern province, of 477 rape victims seen in 2001, 285, more than half, were less than 15 years old, and 45, that is 10%, less than 5 years old. But beyond these cases, of which some have been highlighted in the media, rape, or more widely, unwanted sex under constraints, is very frequent, whether by known or unknown perpetrators, sometimes in commercial sex, often in conjugal relations. But here again, one cannot separate sexual violence from everyday physical violence, and very often the perpetrators are the same. These violence have a genealogy in the routinization of political violence as a dominant mode of government under the previous regime, and of social violence as well as a result of the lack of public authority in townships and Bantustan during this period. Most adults, especially African adults, have grown up knowing nothing else than this kind of power relations, whether from the state or from their own community. The three factors just described are usually combined, as it is the case, for instance, with what some anthropologists recently called survival sex in the townships, where young women from impoverished rural areas who would not define themselves as prostitutes use their body as an economic resource, going out with boys they have just met in bars where drunkenness lowers inhibition in order to get food, shelter, and sometimes warmth, even if it is precarious. However, the image of multiple partnership, which has been so often used to blame African sexuality and which has given the stigmatizing expression of sexual promiscuity, which we should ban from our vocabulary, as it is considered as infamous by many Africans. This image does not necessarily correspond to epidemiological reality. In the study conducted in the mining town of Carltonville near Johannesburg, women in the neighborhood area of the mine, among whom HIV seroprevalence rate was 37%, was going as high as 58% in the 29-year-old group. But these women were seropositive for 50% of them when they had had 3 partners, 35% for 2 partners, and still 22% for only 1 partner in their whole life. This means that multiple partnership is not a sufficient explanation for sexual transmission, as comparative data from several African countries have recently demonstrated. To understand these figures, we need to undertake a political economy of the mine industry, where the extraction of labor force from the rural areas to the gold mines started at the end of the 19th century and gave birth to a specific social organization of the mine areas where black male workers were and still are accommodated in barracks or hostels far from their spouses, and where the employers would provide or facilitate alcohol consumption and commercial sex. One could talk here of an institutionalization of risk, which strikes prostitutes, 69% seroprevalence, mine workers, 29%, and local women, as I said, 37%. From this data, it is easy to note that behaviors and behaviors and culture, so often referred to when one wants to explain the high rates of seroprevalence in South Africa, are not the right track. What we have to deal with is economic structures and political processes, both embedded in history, what I proposed to designate as social conditions. There is a second dimension of embodied inequality, what I called a moment ago social experience. No more the objective reality of the disease and its determinant, as we've seen, but the subjective reality of the epidemic and the suffering it provokes. What meaning is given both individually and collectively to the affliction and its unequal burden. Thabo Mbeki's letter to world leaders and his speeches later on can be read from this perspective. The search for explanation to the evolution so dramatically worse in Africa than in the Western world, the heterodox version he develops talking of poverty, doubting about the virus, suspecting a racist plot, as echoes in many narratives encountered in the field research I have conducted among laypersons as well as among public health specialists. To accuse them of denialism, as is usually done, might comfort us in the belief that we possess not only the truth, but also the good, while they would represent error and evil. But with this certainty, we will not go very far. I do not plea for relativism, but for scientific work of understanding, which is a first step towards public health action. My hypothesis is that what we call denial is better comprehended if we relate it to inequality. The former is a consequence of the latter. This can be argued in two stages. First stage, denial is not only of reality, it is also of justice. Confronted to any intolerable situation, one may say, it cannot be true. It is not possible. This is a denial of reality. But also, it should not be. It is not fair. This is a denial of justice. In the case of AIDS, both dimensions are present. On the one hand, the reality of an epidemic which is supposed to reduce life expectancy of 20 years in 2 decades, going down from 60 to 40 years between 1990 and 2010 in the best demographic projections, and of which the director of the Medical Research Council says that it might make black people a minority in South Africa within few years. This reality is almost impossible to grab, whether for the person living in the township or for the public health administrator in his ministry. But the fact that this unprecedented misfortune, often compared to apartheid, might occur precisely when South African society has just discovered civil rights, that poor and Africans must have once more the heaviest burden of the epidemic, as they have always had in the history of the country, that finally this government should be accused of genocide for mismanagement of the disease, this is seen as an unbearably unjust and unjustifiable situation for which there can be no words, no meaning. But there is probably more to it. It is not only denial of reality and justice. The doubts expressed on the viral origins of the disease, the favorable reception given to the interpretation of the epidemic as a consequence of immunization program in the 70s, this hypothesis that has gone around, the mistrust of antiretroviral drugs accused of dangerous side effects, the success of Viridin, a locally invented medicine, in fact an industrial solvent, the omnipresence of ideas of conspiracy, whether the malevolence comes from the whites or from the Western world, and its pharmaceutical companies. All this must be referred to a wider interpretative framework. I propose to name it suspicion. It is a very general phenomenon embedded in an experience of domination through which people, black and poor especially, have learned defiance towards the dominant. And it happens that public health has been used historically as an instrument of oppression in South Africa and in other places in the world, especially in times of epidemic. Racial segregation started in 1900 when, explaining their decision on epidemiological arguments, the public authorities of Cape Town massively removed the African population from their dwellings in the city to the so-called native locations under the 1883 Public Health Act. During the 20s and the 30s, tuberculosis, which became endemic in the gold mine industry, served as a pretext for displacement of labor force from the rural area to the industrial compounds and back to the villages after a few years to avoid the workers' resistance to exploitation and the constitution of trade unions. More recently, when AIDS appeared in South Africa, it was immediately interpreted in racist terms by public officials, using supposed sexual promiscuity as a stigmatizing explanation, denouncing the danger of black population that black population represented to the nation, and even rejoicing publicly for some of them, of the most conservative parties, that Africans might be eliminated through this welcome disaster. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission in 1998 made people discover, as several of its protagonists confessed their own crimes, that a chemical and biological warfare program against blacks had been secretly developed by a research center headed by a physician, Dr. Wouter Basson, and his colleagues as a national policy supported by international intelligence services. Several microbes were used against opponents such as anthrax. Contraceptive methods inducing definitive sterility were tried on African women, and a plan of contamination of the black population by HIV through prostitutes was imagined and seemed to have probably started. What might have seemed phantasmagoria in other countries here was plain reality, admitted by the biologist perpetrators of these criminal activities and discussed every day in the media as the so-called Dr. Death trial was going on from 2000 to 2002. In this context, suspicion towards biomedical science, either seen as white or Western, becomes a little less obscure. In the interviews I have carried on in the townships, popular mistrust was recently extended even to the state, its government, and its justice. This is the social experience of AIDS today in South Africa. What Puleng, as she lay dying, was writing to the world, and I believe that's what she was doing, writing to the world, telling me her life story and giving me a short, interrupted diary, knowing that I would use it outside of her township and country. So what she was writing is something of this social condition and this social experience of AIDS, of this injustice which was killing her. She knew that during her whole life, she had been the victim of inequality, of which her death from AIDS was a final sign. Embodied inequality at its ultimate point. Of this injustice, we here today are not only the witnesses. Of this injustice, we as researchers and citizens of the world are also the actors. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Didier, for grounding, if I may say so, our discourse on infectious diseases in the individual and the perception and the social context he or she is embedded in. So the floor is open now for questions and comments. There are also, if there are leftover questions from the morning panel, they're also welcome to join. So please. Yes, please. Could you identify yourself as soon as you've got the microphone?
I'm Nelima Ohoya from the International Atomic Energy Agency. But my comment is not, my comment is as an African because I'm from Kenya. It is interesting that, and I don't mean to belittle Pauline, but if she died at 29, she has a 12-year-old daughter, she's had 4 boyfriends. I mean, for me, that raises a lot of question marks. And these question marks then lead me to wonder, what is the issue about sexual promiscuity? I mean, if it's a factor in Africa, I think that it's an issue that we need to live with. Let's be honest about it. It is not to belittle the people of Africa by saying that they're sexually promiscuous. If that is what it is, if that is what HIV/AIDS is about, then let's face it, let's be honest. Let's talk about it. Let's not treat it as belittling or people getting personal about it. That's the reality.
Yeah, I think you should answer.
In fact, what is called sexual promiscuity is a very pejorative way of designating sexual behaviors that are supposed to be deviant to a norm, which is to have a certain number of partners and to have a certain kind of sexuality. What I try to say is that, of course, we all know that in Africa, as in other places in the world, sexual transmission is, many places in the world, sexual transmission is the main mode of transmission. And of course, if we talk of behaviors, if we talk about sexual behavior, this is quite normal, just like it is quite normal to talk about the virus or to talk about immunity. The problem is when it becomes an explanation, an easy explanation, a wrong explanation, and a pejorative explanation. When I say wrong, I say that I'm referring very objectively and very simply to epidemiologic studies that show that in different countries, when you try to explain the different levels of seroprevalence, high levels in some countries and low levels in others, the number of partners in the whole life does not appear to be a risk factor. I do not mean, and you've seen in my example, that the more partners in a specific area, the more partners you have, the more risk you have. Of course, that is what I said. But this is not sufficient, especially when you compare this. I remember to have been extremely astonished by a study by a famous demographer, I'm trying to find his first name, Caldwell. In fact, there are a couple, James Caldwell and Pat Caldwell. They were working in Nigeria, where at that time, I don't know how it is now, at that time, they had one of the lowest levels of seroprevalence in Africa. And they were going on the sexual promiscuity and this kind of thing in Nigeria. So there was something going wrong. We go with this kind of projection, and they are not related to epidemiological facts. So I think what we have to understand first is this kind of relation between social and sexual behaviors and epidemiological facts. This is one thing we have to deal with. I do not mean to underestimate the fact that in certain conditions or in certain categories there is, as you say, there is certain easiness in sexual relations, but I think we should be very careful when we put a relation between when we infer a relation between the two, because first it might be wrong in many cases, and second it can be very negative for the action you want to do. And I think a lot of the reaction we have in South Africa from the African communities is because of this over-determined prejudice around sexual promiscuity.
Thank you. Other comments? Yes.
Laurie Garrett. One problem I have with the socioeconomic argument, which overall I accept, but is that the country with the highest seroprevalence of HIV is actually the country that has been the darling of the World Bank and the IMF, with the greatest prosperity and GDP growth of any country in all of sub-Saharan Africa, and that's Botswana. When Mbeki raises the argument that socioeconomics alone can explain everything, and brings in these third-rate hacks from California state colleges who have never been published in any major journal in the entire world in any discipline as his advisors on socioeconomics and HIV, he cannot possibly talk about Botswana. He cannot possibly address the fact that there's more going on than just how much money people have in their bank accounts and who controls cash.
Yeah, I think there are 2 points in your 2 points in your question or comment. One is about the dissidents, and the other is about the determinants. About the dissidents, I hope I made my point clear that I was not in support of the dissidents, but I hope I also made it clear that I think we have a collective responsibility as researchers, both in biomedical sciences and social sciences, in not bringing with sufficiently strength explanations which could take into account the biomedical, behavioral aspects and the socioeconomic aspects. And the lack of this presence of anthropological, sociological, economic works, besides the fact that there are some of us, and Paul is one of them, few of them, who have done this. And in South Africa, there is a tradition among the historians in particular of this political economy of health. But the absence of this space for an explanation, a complex explanation of the social and the biomedical, as and I'm referring to all the studies done by WHO and all the USAID and all the programs that have been done all over Africa that are always, and especially the KABP studies, which I have nothing against, but which only show one side of the picture. And I'm referring also to the first work of the anthropologists in Africa in the 80s. And I've published a few years ago a sociology of the anthropology of AIDS in Africa, showing how anthropologists had come to something that might be of the 19th century prejudices of Africa when this epidemic came back. So I think with culturalism, in a sense that really we thought there was, I mean, lay culturalism, I'm not talking about culturalist theory, that we might have thought that it was from the, an ancient past. So I think that there was no space, and I'm not rewriting the history, because maybe if there had been more space for this kind of interpretations, the president would have done the same. But there was no place for really a solid interpretation of the epidemic, mixing political economy and biomedical models. So if I may go as far as what I'm saying now, I would say that we call denial the fact that the President Thabo Mbeki emits wrongly, from my point of view, emits doubts about the the causal link between the virus and the disease. But we don't call denial the fact that so little has been said and so little has been done on the social aspects of the disease in many years of research. And I think we should try to think about that also. So, but as far as your second point, which is very, very true and very, very stimulating, the fact that Botswana is the country where you have the worst, the highest levels of seroprevalence. This is very puzzling. You're right. I think some of the aspects I have referred to, which have to do with history and which have to do with migration, are also relevant. But I think probably more work needs to be done, and I don't know very well the history of Botswana, but I think it would be a very interesting case. You're right.
Thank you very much.